September 7th, 1945. Berlin. The streets of the Third Reich's ruined capital are filled with Allied troops, but the attention of everyone present is fixed on a column of Soviet equipment slowly moving across the cobblestones. 52 steel monsters with a previously unseen hull shape pass by the stands where American and British generals stand frozen. What they see causes them to turn pale beneath their military tans. The IS-3 tanks, nicknamed the Pike Nose for the characteristic shape of their frontal section, produce the effect of an exploding bomb, even though not one of them has fired a single shot in battle. Western military experts feverishly take notes, trying to discern construction details, understand the angles of the armor, and estimate the caliber of the gun. Every detail of this machine tells them one thing. The Soviet Union has created something that makes all Allied tanks combined obsolete. However, the history of this tank did not begin at the Victory Parade, but a year earlier in a stifling design bureau where engineers leaned over blueprints, studying terrifying photographs of knocked-out Soviet tanks. The Battle of Kursk had thundered to a close. Soviet troops were driving the enemy west, but the price of victory was high, too high. A special commission traveled to frontline units, recording damage to IS-2 tanks, and the picture that emerged was discouraging. German 88mm guns were piercing the frontal armor of Soviet heavy tanks, turning them into burning coffins for their crews. Designers understood that simply increasing armor thickness would not solve the problem. A revolutionary approach was needed, something that would make enemy shells slide off the hull without causing harm. In the late summer of 1944, work began on a project code-named Kirovets 1. The main task was to create a hull and turret shape that would provide maximum projectile resistance with minimum weight. Engineers proposed a bold solution, making the nose of the hull not flat, but triple-sloped with a maximum armor tilt angle so that shells would ricochet without even attempting to penetrate the steel. The idea seemed insane, as no tank in the world possessed such a hull shape. But time was pressing, the front demanded new equipment, and the designers took the risk. A thick 110mm plate of frontal armor was positioned to form a forward protruding cone-shaped nose, which instantly earned the nickname Pike Nose for its characteristic sharp profile. Simultaneously with the hull work, the development of a fundamentally new turret was underway, which was intended to be just as invulnerable. Designers abandoned the high turrets of previous models and created a flattened, hemispherical construction with steep angles of inclination, providing excellent shell resistance while being significantly harder to hit. Every detail was worked out based on frontline experience. Every decision was checked and rechecked because there was no time to correct mistakes. The war was in full swing. Soviet tanks were burning on the battlefields, and the new machine had to turn the tide. In the spring of 1945, the first experimental batch left the factory workshops. When the military saw the finished tanks, they were amazed. Before them stood a machine of the future, looking as if it had arrived from another time. A low, streamlined silhouette, a sharp pike nose, and a flattened turret with the powerful barrel of a 122mm D-25T gun. All of this produced an impression of absolute invulnerability and deadly power. The tank weighed 46 tons, could reach speeds of up to 40 kilometers per hour, and carried an ammunition load of 28 separate loading shells capable of destroying any enemy armored vehicle with the first hit. But fate dealt a cruel hand. The tanks came off the assembly line too late. The war in Europe was already ending, and the IS-3 never managed to reach the front. May of '45 brought victory, but the new tank remained without its baptism of fire, and many believed its finest hour would never come. However, the Soviet command decided to show the world its new weapon in the most spectacular way. As the Allied parade was being prepared in Berlin, the decision was made to showcase the newest IS-3s. When 52 tanks lined up in a column to move through Berlin, the Soviet military knew perfectly well what effect this would have on the Western Allies. Americans and Britons were used to considering their Shermans and Churchills powerful enough machines. But what they saw at the parade surpassed all their conceptions of tank building. Western generals could not take their eyes off these low-slung steel predators, whose shape seemed created by an alien intelligence. United States and British intelligence services immediately began feverish work, trying to find out the characteristics of the new Soviet machine. But information was extremely scarce, and what they managed to learn was shocking. The technical solutions embedded in the IS-3 were truly revolutionary for their time. The pike nose provided such armor slope angles that German 88mm tank guns, which pierced almost everything encountered on the battlefield, were powerless against this construction. Shells simply ricocheted off the inclined surfaces without causing any harm to the tank. Designers achieved an equivalent frontal armor resistance that reached incredible values, turning the IS-3 into a practically invulnerable fortress during a frontal attack. The new turret was also a revelation in tank building. Its flattened hemispherical shape, with sharply differentiated armor, made it possible to deflect hits from various angles. This design proved so successful that it was subsequently used in the creation of other Soviet heavy tanks, including the IS-7 and the T-10. The turret rotated on a race with a diameter of nearly 2 meters, and the D-25T gun installed in it could fire with vertical aiming angles from -3 to +20 degrees, allowing it to effectively engage targets on both flat and hilly terrain. The crew of 4 was accommodated quite comfortably by wartime standards. The driver mechanic received his own hatch in the hull roof, which had been impossible on the previous IS-1 and IS-2 models. This innovation allowed the removal of the direct view slit in the frontal armor, which had always been a weak point in protection. In its place, periscopic observation devices were installed, giving an excellent view without compromising the armor. The commander, gunner, and loader were located in the turret, which featured a TS-17 telescopic articulated sight with 4 times magnification and a 15-degree field of vision, ensuring accurate aiming at the target. The tank's armament was no less impressive than its armor. The 122mm rifle D-25 gun, model of 1943, had a barrel length of 48 calibers and fired an armor-piercing shell with an initial velocity of 800 meters per second. Such a shell-pierced armor 160 millimeters thick at a distance of 1,000 meters, meaning the guaranteed destruction of any enemy tank with a single hit. The gun was equipped with a 2-chamber muzzle brake, which effectively suppressed recoil upon firing, and a horizontal wedge gate with mechanical semi-automatics, allowing a rate of fire of 2 to 3 rounds per minute. The ammunition load consisted of 28 separate case loading rounds. Due to the large size of the high-explosive fragmentation shells, only armor-piercing ammunition could be placed in 11 of the stowage points. The standard load suggested 18 high-explosive fragmentation and 10 armor-piercing shells, giving the commander flexibility in choosing combat tactics. The 7.62mm DTM machine gun coaxial with the main gun had an ammunition load of 2,000 rounds of various types, including armor-piercing incendiary and tracer rounds, allowing for effective combat against enemy infantry. On the turret roof was a 12.7mm DSHK heavy anti-aircraft machine gun on a ring turret mount. This formidable weapon could provide circular fire with vertical aiming angles from -4 to +84 degrees and was equipped with a K-8T collimator sight designed for firing at aerial targets, moving at speeds of up to 400 kilometers per hour at altitudes up to 400 meters. Admittedly, using this machine gun required the gunner to rise from under the protection of the armor through the hatch, which involved significant risk under enemy fire. Therefore, in the traveling position, the machine gun was demounted from the turret and secured on the right side of the turret. The heart of the tank was a V-shaped 12-cylinder 4-stroke liquid-cooled diesel engine, model V11, developing 520 horsepower. This powerful unit provided the 46-ton tank with a maximum highway speed of about 40 kilometers per hour and a range of 340 kilometers on internal fuel tanks. The engine's fuel system included 4 fuel tanks with a total capacity of 425 liters, located in the engine compartment on the sides of the engine and in internal sponson niches, as well as 4 external cylindrical tanks on the roof of the engine compartment with a capacity of 90 liters each. This fuel supply allowed the tank to make long marches without refueling, which was critically important in the conditions of a rapid offensive. The cooling system consisted of 2 plate tube radiators arranged in a semicircle above the main clutch, with fans mounted on its shaft to ensure effective heat dissipation even under maximum engine loads. To facilitate starting in cold weather, especially relevant for harsh Soviet winters, the engine was equipped with a special heating device, allowing the power plant to start even at extremely low temperatures. This detail showed how carefully the designers considered the operation of the tank in real combat conditions, where equipment had to work reliably in any weather and at any time of year. The classic layout, with the engine transmission compartment in the rear of the hull and the fighting compartment in the center, proved its effectiveness and ensured optimal weight distribution of the machine. However, beneath the external perfection and fearsome appearance lay serious problems that Western observers at the Berlin Parade did not even suspect. Already in early 1946, a special commission was created to analyze the defects of the IS-3. What it revealed forced designers to clutch their heads. Engines failed with frightening regularity. The gearbox operated extremely unreliably, and cracks in the hull armor elements were discovered in the area of the engine transmission compartment, which could have led to catastrophic consequences in battle. The primary cause of these numerous problems was the fact that the IS-3 was designed under wartime conditions and remained, essentially, a product of an emergency period. The front demanded new equipment immediately. Tight time frames did not allow for a detailed refinement of the project, and physically, designers simply did not have time to bring all components to the required level of reliability. Many technical solutions, including some unsuccessful ones, were borrowed in finished form from the IS-2, and new components often did not undergo sufficient testing before being launched into serial production. As a result, all manufactured tanks had to undergo large-scale modernization under a special program for the elimination of structural defects. Engineers worked day and night trying to fix the identified flaws, but despite all efforts, the machines could never be brought to the required level of operational standards. By mid-1946, it became obvious that further production of the IS-3 in its current form was impractical, and the tank was taken off the assembly line, although over 2,000 units had been produced. Nevertheless, despite the technical problems, the IS-3 continued to enter service with heavy tank and self-propelled artillery regiments of the Soviet Army, where it was operated alongside the IS-2. Tankers quickly learned how to handle the temperamental equipment, and with proper technical maintenance, the machines demonstrated quite acceptable reliability. The main advantage remained its unsurpassed protection, which made the IS-3 practically invulnerable to most anti-tank weapons of that time. The first and only combat use of the IS-3 within the Soviet armed forces occurred in 1956 in Hungary, when an anti-Soviet uprising broke out in the country. The Soviet command threw significant forces into the suppression of the unrest, including units armed with IS-3s. The tanks moved through the streets of Budapest, crushing pockets of resistance, and performed excellently. Losses were isolated, confirming the effectiveness of the machine's heavy armor and armament in urban combat, where tanks were subjected to fire from anti-tank grenade launchers and light guns at close range. The Hungarian events remained the only episode of IS-3 participation in real combat operations under Soviet flags. But the tank's story did not end there. In the 80s, these machines were still in service with reserve tank divisions in the Transbaikal Military District. The 80th Reserve Tank Division had 270 IS-3M tanks, a modernized version where structural defects of the base model had been partially eliminated. These tanks were stored in case of a major war and could be quickly put into service if it were necessary to reinforce frontline units with heavy armor. Regarding deliveries to Warsaw Pact allies, the USSR showed surprising stinginess. Only 2 tanks were transferred to Poland in 1946, exclusively for familiarization with the design and instructor training. The Poles used these machines in parades and as training vehicles until the 70s, carefully preserving the rare equipment. Another example was sent to Czechoslovakia in 1950, where it met roughly the same fate: ceremonial service and a demonstration of Soviet tank-building capabilities to local military specialists. However, there was one country that received the IS-3 in truly significant quantities, and that country was Egypt. Cairo purchased a total of 100 machines, including both base modifications and the modernized IS-3M variant. The first batch arrived in the late 50s, while the bulk of the tanks were delivered between 1962 and 1967. The Egyptian military leadership had high hopes for the Soviet heavy tanks, intending to use them as a strike force in the confrontation with Israel. The powerful armor and crushing gun of the IS-3 were to be an ace in the hands of Egyptian tankers, capable of turning the tide of any battle. But reality proved much harsher than the plans of Cairo's generals. When the Six-Day War broke out in 1967, the IS-3s faced modern Western tanks in real combat for the first time, and the result was catastrophic. Egyptian crews were extremely poorly trained. Many tankers had barely learned to operate the complex machine and completely lacked the skill to use its strengths in battle. Furthermore, the war took on the character of a highly mobile confrontation where speed, mobility, and rate of fire played the decisive role. These were precisely the qualities the IS-3 could not boast of. Israeli Centurions and M48s were significantly more maneuverable. Their crews were incomparably better prepared, and the rate of fire of their guns allowed for several shots in the time it took an IS-3 crew to reload its powerful but slow cannon. The theoretical advantage in armor proved useless when tanks were knocked out from the flanks and rear, where protection was significantly weaker. Egyptian tankers could not turn their heavy machines fast enough to meet the threat. The Israelis attacked swiftly and decisively, using superiority in tactical training and maneuverability. A few IS-3s still managed to knock out enemy tanks, proving that with proper use, the machine remained a dangerous opponent. But these were rare episodes against the backdrop of the general rout of the Egyptian armored forces. During the retreat, the Egyptian army simply abandoned its equipment, and the IS-3s were no exception. Tankers left functional machines, fleeing under the onslaught of Israeli troops. As a result, more than half of the 72 lost IS-3s fell to the enemy in fully operational condition. For the Israeli army and defense, this was a true gift. The captured Soviet heavy tanks were carefully studied, tested, and even inducted into their own armored forces, where they were operated until the early 70s. Israeli military engineers discovered that the V-11 engines in many captured machines were heavily worn and required replacement. The solution proved simple and elegant. Instead of the original motors, they installed V-54 diesels taken from previously captured Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks, which the Israelis had in abundance. These engines were more reliable and easier to maintain, significantly simplifying the operation of the trophy IS-3s. Often, along with the engine, the roof of the engine transmission compartment was also transferred, creating hybrid machines that combined Soviet armor with a more modern power plant. As battle tanks, the Israelis practically never used the IS-3s, realizing the era of heavy tanks was ending and that these machines, with their technical problems and low mobility, did not meet modern requirements for armor. However, several IS-3s found use as tank recovery vehicles, where their powerful engines and sturdy chassis were very useful. During the War of Attrition in 1969 and 70, the Israelis devised a completely unusual use for the trophy tanks. Several machines were stripped of their engines and transmissions, which were removed to clear space for additional ammunition. These immobile steel monsters were placed at important sectors of the front as long-term firing points, where their heavy armor and crushing guns could provide maximum benefit. The IS-3s were transformed into a kind of armored pillbox, firing at Egyptian positions across the Suez Canal. The crews methodically fired off their ammunition loads, hitting targets on the opposite bank until the shells ran out completely. After depleting all ammunition, 2 of these immobile tanks were captured once again by Egyptian troops who managed to cross the canal and attack Israeli positions. The Egyptians discovered the empty steel hulls of their own former tanks, which had managed to serve 2 armies and change owners twice without firing a single shot in the third act of their combat career. A significant number of IS-3s was also received by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, where Soviet tanks began arriving in the 60s. There were at least 2 regiments in the Korean People's Army fully equipped with these heavy machines. The North Korean military leadership viewed the IS-3 as a powerful deterrent in the confrontation with South Korea and the American troops stationed on the peninsula. The tanks were kept in full combat readiness. Crews regularly underwent training, and the machines periodically appeared in parades in Pyongyang, demonstrating the military power of the North Korean regime. However, North Korean IS-3s did not participate in real combat operations, since after the end of the Korean War in 1953, a shaky armistice was established on the peninsula, which, though violated by regular border incidents, did not lead to full-scale tank battles. Nevertheless, the mere fact that North Korea possessed a significant number of heavy tanks forced the South Korean command and American military to take this threat seriously when planning the defense of the demilitarized zone. By the early 70s, it became definitively clear that the era of heavy tanks had irrevocably passed into history. A new generation of main battle tanks combined powerful armament with good armor protection and high mobility, making specialized heavy machines unnecessary. The IS-3 was gradually withdrawn from the front line, giving way to more modern equipment, but there was no rush to decommission them completely. In the Soviet Union, a significant number of these tanks went into long-term storage in reserve units, where they were to wait for their hour in case of a major war. In the early 80s, during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Egyptian army still had 1 regiment equipped with IS-3s in its ranks. However, there is no reliable information about the participation of these tanks in combat operations against Israel. Most likely, the Egyptian command, remembering the sad experience of the Six-Day War, preferred not to risk the obsolete machines and kept them in reserve, using more modern T-55 and T-62 tanks in battle. By that point, the IS-3 was definitively obsolete both morally and technically, and its use against the latest generation of Israeli tanks would have been simple suicide for the crews. The history of the IS-3 shows how complex and contradictory the path of a combat machine can be. A tank created as the pinnacle of wartime engineering, possessing a revolutionary design and a terrifying appearance, never managed to realize its potential on the battlefield. It arrived too late for the war for which it was created. Technical problems prevented it from becoming a truly reliable machine, and by the time it had the chance to fight, it was already hopelessly obsolete. Nevertheless, it was the IS-3 that exerted a colossal influence on the development of global tank building. The appearance of this tank at the 1945 Berlin Parade was a true shock to the West and served as a catalyst for the intensive development of new armor models in the USA and Great Britain. Western designers feverishly sought an answer to the Soviet challenge, trying to create tanks capable of countering the IS-3. The revolutionary pike nose armor scheme was carefully studied and influenced the design of subsequent generations of tanks worldwide. The flattened turret of the IS-3 became the prototype for many designs created in the 50s and 60s. Soviet designers did not stop at what they had achieved and used the experience of creating the IS-3 when developing subsequent models of heavy tanks. The turret design found application on the IS-7 and the T-10. The concept of differentiated armor with maximum inclination angles became a standard of Soviet tank building for many years. Even the technical problems of the IS-3 brought benefits, forcing engineers to refine new projects more carefully and not repeat mistakes made in the haste of wartime. Paradoxically, a tank that practically did not fight turned out to be one of the most influential in the history of armored vehicles. Its psychological impact on the enemy was enormous, and the technical solutions implemented in its design defined the paths of tank building development for decades. The IS-3 became a symbol of Soviet military might, a demonstration of what Soviet industry and design were capable of. When these tanks drove through the streets of Berlin, they carried a clear message to the world. The Soviet Union possesses technologies and capabilities that make it one of the strongest military powers on the planet. Today, surviving examples of the IS-3 can be seen in many tank museums around the world, where they hold a place of honor among the legendary machines of the past.